The life of Oscar Micheaux begins in Metropolis, Illinois on January 2nd, 1884. This is when a young Oscar will be born and brought into the world by his parents Calvin and Belle Micheaux. Oscar's parents, Calvin and Belle, were slaves in Kentucky for their entire lives until they moved across the Ohio River to Illinois, where Oscar is born. This is in 1884, and after this, the family can finally grow their own wheat and corn on an 80-acre farm on which they worked. After working on the farm, Oscar began to pick up jobs around Chicago, including as a Pullman porter. Pullman porters were people who carried bags for wealthy train riders, and there was no shortage of wealthy train riders in Chicago. Around this time is when Oscar begins to realize, like many other black homesteaders, that the idea of land ownership, political and social freedoms, rights, and especially respect were the ideal goal. Shortly after this, President Abraham Lincoln then declares that all persons held as slaves are, and henceforward, declared free, and now Oscar and those around him look to build a new life. He wants to provide for a family and educate his future children. But out of all of this, his aspiration to own his own land was finally within reach. Then, in 1904, Oscar Micheaux travels to South Dakota. He travels here in order to participate in a lottery run by the General Land Office. If he wins, he could be the new owner of his very own land, a feat he and many others imagined as impossible. With more than 100,000 people trying to claim just 2,400 plots of land, he didn't get his hand in the jar quite quick enough. Instead, he chooses to hire a land locator. This land locator would cost Micheaux $80. Today, this amount would equal about $2,667.94 with inflation, but he finally obtained what he wanted, the Promised Land. This land would be in the Rosebud Indian Reservation and would be solely Micheaux's. After running out of luck with the lottery and having to dish out the $80 to find a land locator, his best efforts still hadn't paid off. Through his first year of farming, his profits didn't reflect the Promised Land success that he had earned. Instead, he dealt with a 3-year drought that destroyed his crops, but this only fueled his efforts to become successful. It's said that around this time, he develops a grudging respect, then to acceptance, and finally to admiration, when the white people around him realize that he had broken more acres of prairie than most of them. This is important because Oscar finally begins to feel comfortable in his environment, and this is not something that anyone else in his position could have felt, given that he was a black landowner. Around this time, Micheaux develops feelings for a local white woman, knowing a relationship like this could take everything he had earned away from him. Later, in 1910, Oscar would marry a school teacher instead, named Orlean McCracken. Together, they would parent Orlean's daughter from a previous marriage with a reverend from Chicago. Oftentimes, Oscar would travel for his work, leaving Orlean to feel abandoned and alone, which is capped off by a miscarriage that she had had while he was away. Orlean's family wasn't impressed with Oscar's support of their daughter and began to sell Oscar's belongings while he was gone in order to pay for the land that Oscar was living on. Essentially, they sold all of his belongings in order to buy his property. With much effort, Micheaux tried and failed to get Orlean back as well as his land. This would result in divorce in 1917, which also begins the long life of his writing experiences. Oscar begins writing down his experiences as a homesteader as a way to cope with the hardships that he's enduring. His writings became a mix of fiction and biography meant to tell the entire story of what he was dealing with, and especially the conquest of his land. Soon after, he had created a full-length book that he named The Conquest. This book would become very popular, and it would be one of his first. Shortly after writing this first book, he would travel throughout the region, selling this to his friends and neighbors. This enterprise would soon lead to the second novel, The Homesteader. After writing his first 2 books and realizing the traction that they were gaining in not only the African American community, but the white community as well, he was approached by a production company that wanted to turn them into a movie. The production company that approached Micheaux was called Lincoln Motion Picture Company, which became the first movie company ever owned and controlled by black filmmakers. Because the film company was primarily owned by black filmmakers, all of their production, as well as all of the cost, fell onto the black filmmakers. Oscar Micheaux would then adapt his first story into a film, becoming known as the first African-American filmmaker and director in 1919 through his Homesteader movie, and it's considered to be a lost film that ended up launching his career. Over the next 30 years, he would make more than 40 films independently, and his work would be preserved by the Library of Congress and the National Film Registry as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The importance of Micheaux's films did not only carry the weight of the first African-American filmmaker, but they also provided a window into black life and the African-American perspective on race. These films would prove crucial when looking back in history at how African-Americans and white Americans looked over race and what challenges African-Americans would have to face in a life where no one respected them. Shortly after making his first film, in 1926, Oscar Micheaux would remarry to Alice B. Russell. She would later appear in 6 of his films. After a long life of filmmaking, a long life of traveling, and a long life of book writing, Oscar would pass away of heart failure on March 25th, 1951, at the age of 67 in Charlotte, North Carolina, while on a business trip. Oscar would be buried in Great Bend, Kansas. Oscar's gravestone would read, "A man ahead of his time."